Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the MHA Construction webinar. The latest MHA report on the state of the construction sector was launched last week, and we have a panel of four to talk to you today, and a great guest speaker to discuss the report as well. Just on MHA itself, MHA is an association of 8 leading accounting firms in the UK with over 50 offices spread around, as you can see from the map. And through MHA, we are also the UK representatives of Baker Tilly International, which has 746 offices in 147 territories. I'm not quite sure what happened to Greenland, but we'll move on from that. Just onto the panellists. I'm Robert Dowling, head of construction and real estate for MHA. I'm based down on the south coast. We have with us also Brendan Sharkey, who is the head of construction and real estate at MHA MacIntyre Hudson in the city office, and Steve Plaskett, who's head of construction and real estate at MHA Tate Walker in the northeast, based in Newcastle, I believe. We also have with us, in terms of speakers and panelists today, we're going to hear from Mark Berrisford-Smith in a minute, and David Price, the finance editor of Construction News. Mark is head of economics for HSBC Commercial Banking. He's an experienced public speaker. He's been at HSBC for more than 30 years and advises HSBC on its commercial and corporate clients on developments in the global and UK economies. David's involvement in the construction industry goes back 13 years, although you wouldn't believe it to look at him when you see him, starting off working for clients in the infrastructure realm before moving into project delivery in the building market. He's then made the jump to covering the industry as a journalist in late 2017 and leads the Construction News' finance coverage, which also includes producing the annual CM100 list. We're going to start off by hearing from Brendan in terms of the key findings from the report. So over to you, Brendan.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Robert. Our survey looked at 5 specific areas: impact of COVID-19, funding, employment, technology, and looking forward. So taking COVID-19 as the first stop, what is evident from the survey is that COVID-19 has brought about change. Some change may not be permanent, such as the social distancing, flexible working hours, travel. However, technology introduction at 43% is probably permanent. Government support. For many, this appears to have been essential, with a significant take-up of furloughing, 81%, and VAT deferrals, 68%. However, the government-backed loans was not as popular. Maybe for the SME sector, maybe not considered either necessary or probably a waste of time in talking to the bank. We also asked for views on the EU, and we asked what were the biggest challenges. Sorry, out of sync. We asked what the biggest challenges were. There was very little surprises in the biggest challenges. All the usual suspects were mentioned. However, you'll note that the concern over the economy was far and away the biggest concern. So let's look at funding. Remarkably, 73% were not looking for funding, with only 21% applying, and there were 6% that actually got refused. The lack of funding for that 6% impacted their capacity to work. There was no real desire to see specific funding for the construction sector. Where funding was obtained, only 27% was through banks, who are not thought to favour the construction industry. In other words, businesses went elsewhere. Employment. Employment is probably the biggest direct cost for a contractor. For most businesses, action was taken. Furloughing was, as previously recorded, a major support at 79%. Surprisingly, 32% undertook redundancies. Seems high by my experience. But I think management took the opportunity to resolve issues that have been put off as time to time. COVID as a reason for action. Wage reduction at 11% seemed low to me, as many businesses I talked to pursued this policy. EU workers working in the UK was part of our survey. Only 62% of the respondents had EU citizens engaged for on-site work, possibly higher than what I would have expected, given that the survey covers England and part of Scotland. However, at the present time, Brexit and its implications do not appear to be the major significance that we might think it is. So what about technology? Technology in the construction industry is still not for everybody, with 38% not looking to utilise technology. However, on the flip side, we have 62% either adopting or proposing to adopt new technology. My instincts are that in 12 months' time, that percentage will be even higher. What is good to see is the complete mix of technology being adopted. We've got the usual suspects in accountancy, forecasting and timesheets, but we've got drones, off-site construction, communication systems for teams, the adoption of camera, robotics, excellent. However, it is a shame that with all that investment and development, only 33% are claiming R&D. Contractors are missing out on an opportunity. Awareness of the importance of green technology, along with sustainability, is clearly gaining traction, with 45% expecting to invest in green technology. And I think this will be a major driver for investment in the future. So what about the future? Looking forward, I'm sure the answers would vary on a daily basis given the pronouncements on the effect of COVID-19. However, 60% of the respondents were looking for either flat or growth in turnover, whilst 40% were not. Growth, not surprising, was correlated to and dependent on economic activity, which is the clear driver and the impetus business are looking for. The prognosis for a return to pre-lockdown activity, for 30% of the respondents, that was considered to be a year away. The inference is that there is no real confidence in the sector in the longer term, and this is reflected by only 29% expecting to make capital investments within a year. There's a brief overview of our survey. I hope you've looked at the survey in detail. There's some very interesting points that have come to light. And now I'll hand you back to Robert. Robert.
Sorry, we're now going to hear from Mark Berrisford-Smith, who some of you may have heard previously. Mark's a wonderful speaker on all matters to do with the economy. We've asked him to produce something for us in relation to the sector, which he did for us yesterday, so it's fairly hot off the press. So if I can start.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to speak at your conference. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but I've got other things to do, I'm afraid, this morning that were already in the diary. So I'm going to talk for 5 to 10 minutes about the state, particularly of the UK economy, and where we find ourselves and how I think things are going to shape up moving from here. The effect of the national lockdown back in March and April was to throw the economy into a massive economic downturn, which knocked about 27% off our GDP in April compared with February. It's possible that some countries had bigger contractions, but because most of them don't do their GDP on a monthly basis, we don't know. I suspect France maybe did, and so possibly did Italy and Spain. But the feature of the UK lockdown was that it was fairly long. It was the middle of June before we reopened our non-essential shops. So when you look at the comparisons of where we were, say, in the second quarter against where we were in the fourth quarter of last year, and that's a fair comparison that you can make with other economies, we look pretty bad. But that was because the best of our recovery was still happening, was still to come. So we started to grow our way out in May. That was a fairly tentative revival based on nothing more than estate agents and garden centres. The non-essential shops open in June. The pubs, bars, restaurants, hairdressers get going in July. So by the time we get to July, the economy is made up just over half of the lost ground. What's happened since, and we don't yet have the official numbers for this, but what's happened since will be further growth in August and September. So I think commercial activity will have been slower, would have grown more slowly in September than it did in August. Certainly that's what all the surveys are suggesting. But September would have been boosted quite a lot by the reopening of schools and universities. So I think by the end of September, we're probably in a position where the economy is about 5% smaller than it was pre-COVID. In other words, we've made up at least 3/4, possibly a little bit more of the ground lost, which on the one hand looks fairly impressive, but I think puts us pretty much where most other big economies are. And the issue, of course, as we move forward is now, where do we get any more growth? Because I think it's now abundantly obvious we've reopened about all that we can. There's really nothing left to go at. The other things that were supposed to be opening in the autumn aren't going to open. The instruction is that we work at home again if we can. So we're not going to see companies putting people back into offices. So for the next 6 months, I have to say, I don't see this economy really going anywhere. Indeed, depending on the severity of restrictions, it might even retreat a little bit. And then, of course, in January, we've got all the disruption that's going to arise from Brexit, whatever form that takes. So I don't see much growth in the next 6 months. We do see growth as we go through next year, but fairly sluggish. So that by the end of next year, we still have an economy that was probably 2% smaller than it was pre-COVID. So that it doesn't get back to pre-COVID level of activity until the middle of 2022. Now, you're particularly interested in the construction and real estate sector. Obviously, some aspect of real estate, particularly those related to retail and the office market. I don't think it needs me to tell you are going to be very difficult over the next couple of years, not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the changes in behaviour that it's either brought about or that it's accelerated. And I'm thinking there particularly of working from home. I mean, I can't think of any of my colleagues that were doing 5 days in an office even before the virus struck, let alone after it. For the construction sector, alongside manufacturing, it's been one of the fastest reviving parts of the economy. Most construction sites, most manufacturing facilities have found a way to reopen and to keep producing. So for construction, it's not now a question of can we get the sites open, it's more a question of are there the orders. And given how long this is now likely to last, obviously there is a certain amount of reticence out there that you see reflected in some of the business surveys. Now, I'm fully aware the government has a build agenda, but you will know as long as I do how long it takes to get projects through pipeline to the point where somebody can actually put a shovel in the ground. So I think there is scope for a little bit for more revival in the construction sector, but I think you need to be realistic about what you expect. For the economy as a whole, over the next year, growth is going to be very sluggish. Some of the growth numbers that will get reported will look very impressive. When you compare the fourth quarter of 2020 with the third quarter, you are bound to have strong growth because you're comparing where we are in October with where we were in July. And that's two completely different things. The quarterly growth will look quite good. The annual growth when we get to 2021 will look really good. I mean, it may well come in at 6 or 7%. It will look a lot better than it actually is because it's just down to the arithmetic. From here, the going is going to get a lot harder. And then, of course, there's Brexit, which, as I said earlier, has a considerable impact, whichever way it pans out, because even if we do get some sort of agreement, we're going to be out of the single market. We're going to be out of the customs union. Exports to the EU, imports from the EU will require the full panoply of international trade documentation. That is a cost which businesses have not had to face for the best part of 30 years. And that cost will run to quite a few billion. Nobody quite a lot. And that is a cost that will have to be borne by businesses and passed on to consumers if possible. But it is a sufficient cost that it is bound to cause some supply chains to reshape. In the event of a no-deal Brexit, we'd expect the economy by the end of next year not to be 2% short of its pre-COVID GDP, but to be more like 5% short of its pre-COVID GDP, which means in that eventuality, getting back to pre-COVID output doesn't happen in 2022. It gets delayed until 2023. So that's the outlook that we're looking at. A recovery that will hopefully be completed in about 2.5 years. But the point I'd make to you before I leave is that's only half the job done. I mean, getting back to where you started is great, but you're still not back to where you should be. You still missed the growth that you would have expected to have in 2020 and in 2021 and in parts of 2022. You've got to get that back as well. And that's the real challenge. And that's going to take rather longer. Now, it has to be said, the growth we've had in the last few years was hardly spectacular. This economy's underlying speed limit looked in the past decade as if it was about 1.5%. So we've got to get that growth back. The point is that 1.5% is still much slower than it was pre-2008. So there's an awful lot to be done. It's going to take quite some time. And as we go through this, the issue of government finances, as Rishi Sunak discussed at the virtual Conservative Party conference yesterday, will really come to the fore. The UK, unfortunately, has been hit hard by COVID, both by the disease and by the economic consequences. The British government has done more than most to try and cushion the blow. But the deficit this year will be humongous. If it comes in the right side of 350 billion, I will breathe a quiet sigh of relief. But you can't run deficits of 350 billion forever and a day. Rishi knows this. I'm not sure all his party does, but Rishi certainly knows this. And the question is, how are you going to get the public finances onto an even keel? And where are you going to raise your money? Nobody's got the appetite for austerity of the sort that we've had in the past 10 years, whether the government or the general public. That suggests to me that taxation is going to have to play a much bigger role in closing the deficit than it did after the financial crisis. Okay, that's all from me for today. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you very much for listening.
There we are. I hope that was useful to everybody. We're now going to hear from David Price, the finance editor of Construction News, who is going to discuss his thoughts on the future of the construction sector and the results of the CM100 survey that they carried out earlier this year. David.
Okay, excellent. Well, good morning. Well, thank you, Robert. Thanks for inviting me to speak this morning. First I would say, looking at the MHA report, it's good to see that their findings sort of align with what we found in this year's CM100. For anyone not familiar, the CM100, it's a list that Construction News produces every year. We've been doing it for about 20 years now. And we rank the 100 largest firms in the UK by turnover. I took over in 2018, producing it. It was the first post-Carillion one. And something which we learned, well, everyone learned from that, is that decent profit figures can hide a lot of sins. So in 2018, we introduced some financial health measures, which looked at some balance sheet figures, particularly sort of cash and debt, and also working capital ratios. And I think we're the only list of that type which actually includes this information. I'd say this year is good to see that, the MHA report sort of corroborated what we found in ours, which, broadly speaking, it was turnover was up, not massively, but sort of in rounds of 5 to 8%. Cash levels were up, which is very encouraging given everything which is going on at the moment, and profit levels were broadly flat. So returning to the turnover aspect first, we found that the largest firms, so we're talking about the tier 1 contractors in the £1 billion plus range, of which there's about, I think, 16, 17 off the top of my head. Their turnover was fairly flat, which is not surprising. We've seen a lot of restructuring from those firms in recent years, a lot of firms disposing non-core activities, a lot of firms saying, well, we're walking away from riskier jobs, we just want framework jobs, we want two-stage tenders, repeat work, etc. So growth among those firms was fairly flat. The segment below them, so firms in the £300 to £500 million range, where you get some national tier 1 contractors, but a lot of them are more regional based, they were actually growing very fast. We saw a lot of double-digit growth among that group. Now, speaking to some people about, where is this growth coming from? In some cases, it is companies which have a certain niche. We've seen firms which have a strong position in sort of the warehouse and logistics market. They've been growing very fast for obvious reasons. But there is some concern, especially among some of the more London and Southeast focused firms in this range, that this growth is on the back of jobs which some of the larger firms have perhaps been walking away from, not liking the risk so much. And how are they going to manage that? Is that going to come back to bite them? On the profit side, as I said, profit margins are broadly flat, which is, when you consider everything, that's not a bad result, especially amongst the largest tier 1 firms who we've, become used to seeing huge losses in recent years. That sort of stabilised in 2019, although early results from Kia that we had last week suggest that 2020 is going to see a lot of firms posting negative margins again, which is no surprise. But the flat margins also remind us that 2019 was not a particularly easy year. There's obviously the uncertainty around Brexit and all the political changes as well. And some of that stuff has been going on since 2017, 2018. Clients haven't been as quick to go ahead with jobs. So it's been a pretty tough market. So I think for margins to sort of stay stable isn't a bad result at all. And then finally, it's the cash element. Now, I think, Carillion was obviously a seismic event for the industry. It's a big wake-up call, not only for contractors, but for clients as well. Clients really started digging into balance sheets after that and looking at financial health of the firms they were contracting with. And also, obviously, contractors and subcontractors in particular started to think about, how much cash do I want to be running with? How much of a safety net do I need if something particularly bad like Carillion happens? So over the last 2 years, we've seen cash piles build up at firms, and that continued in 2019 going into 2020. And given what has transpired this year, that's very fortunate that's happened. I was speaking to one person for the CM100, and they said, if this pandemic had struck in 2017 pre-Carillion, you could find a lot of firms in a much more difficult situation now, because they haven't been able to do that sort of self-help work to improve their financial health. Now, I just want to talk about the MHA report for a minute, because I think the survey element of that picked up some really interesting things, which are going to, I think the three things which I think are most interesting is the borrowing element, the capex, and the economic slowdown. I think these are going to define not just perhaps the next 12 to 24 months, but 5 years and beyond. So looking at the borrowing element first of all, typically contractors, they don't rely on debt as a major source of capital. Trade credit is tends to be more heavily used. So it's not surprising to see 3/4 almost not interested in haven't applied for the various loan schemes. But then that does raise a question about the other quarter, the other 27%, who have taken on these loans. What are they going to do with this money? How are they going to manage having that debt, being, organisations which typically don't have a lot of debt? Now, the view, or at least the hope, is that a lot of this debt is just contingency, that firms will be getting there just in case the worst does happen, and that sites stay closed for longer, or there is insolvencies and disruption in the supply chain. Now, whether that is the case or not, what we don't want to see is firms who have taken on these loans in difficult situations, then just using them to fund their working capital and basically just living in their overdraft, because that can become very hard to reverse out of, especially if we're going into a situation where the economy slows. So I think keeping an eye on who's been building up debt over the last year and how that's sitting on their balance sheet. Is it, or are these facilities, are they being maxed out, or are they just sat there and they've got the overhead? In the headroom, or are they really using this debt just to continue trading? That's something that I'm certainly looking out for, and something I'd be concerned to see. The next one, capex. Again, industry not typically a capital investment intensive industry because of the subcontracting model. The exceptions are these specialist firms, especially firms such as groundworks firms, who obviously have large plant fleets. Now, it's the lack of capital investment that's been cited as one of the reasons for the low productivity in the industry. And it's a bit concerning that the MHA report shows that firms have been pulling back their capital investment, with, I think it's 51% saying they're not planning to make any significant capital investment over the next year. Now, this is not surprising. Firms, they need to hold on to cash. It's probably for the purpose of survival, it's probably more important to have that cash easily accessible rather than sticking it into an investment which could take 2, 3, 4 or more years to pay off. But it does return us to the question: is how is the industry going to deal with its productivity lag, which has been an issue for years now. There has been some new investment as firms responded to the pandemic, but a lot of this investment has been in what I suppose you'd consider more back office or corporate things. So we're talking about IT investment with things like Microsoft Teams and what have you, which we've used it in our company a lot, and it seems it's hard to think of a world without using that now. But how much is that actually going to improve speed or quality of work on site? Quite possibly not so much. But this could lead to the interesting thing where we could see, especially when the larger firms which are able to maintain large and quite ambitious capital investment programs over the coming 2 to 3 years, they could open up a significant competitive advantage over their rivals. So we could see not quite two stream developing, but certainly some firms, especially the infrastructure realm, really pulling ahead of their rivals. So it'd be interesting to see who can maintain that investment and make it pay off, and how that plays out. Now, most firms I've been speaking to are either due to slower output on site due to and other restrictions were coalescing around expectations of turnover to fall in the 10 to 20% range. Obviously, it depends which market you're in. If you're in infrastructure, you're probably going to have a bit more insulation than if a firm is heavily involved in the commercial building market. So it's quite surprising to see in the MHA report that more than 40% of firms are actually expecting revenue to grow over the next 12 months. This doesn't chime with some of the new order data that we've been seeing, which has shown a recovery from the lows that we saw in April, when things came as close as I think we'll ever see to new orders just stopping. But it's still way down on where we were sort of 12 months ago. So yeah, still way down where we were 12 months ago. Now there is some hope that the public sector is going to step in and save the day with, you know, a load of investment in new hospitals and local transport and the like. But so far, we're not seeing or hearing much activity in that area. From what we've heard, the Department for Health and Transport, they're quite active in scoping out, you know, what be in terms of shovel-ready projects. Department for Education, a bit less so. But even so, as we all know, with public procurement or just construction in general, really, you know, a shovel-ready job still takes a long time to get going and to start on site for the cash to actually start flowing. So I'd say the base case expectation at the moment is less demand for at least the next calendar year, with some viewing that the second half of 2022 is the likeliest time for recovery. So just return to, I think, the main theme that came out of the CM100, looking ahead, was the expectation that we're entering a much more competitive world. Demand is going to fall, certainly from the private sector, you know, expecting quite significant falls in the office, retail markets because of the pandemic, but also the infrastructure market. I think some of the optimism around some of the big pipelines and how quickly they're going to get going, I think there's perhaps been a bit too much optimism in that area. So this brings us to some common problems which could arise, which, you know, they happen every time we get a downturn, which is lowball bidding, slowdown in payment, and clients dumping risk. Now, on bidding, we're hearing that at the top of the chain, pricing is still relatively sensible on new jobs, but it's a different story as you go down sort of tier 2, tier 3 and beyond. We're hearing that there's some very hungry firms out there, and the tier 1s aren't in a hurry to discourage some of this very low pricing. I heard recently of an M&E specialist being awarded a large job, which is equal to almost 2 years turnover, which maybe they've made some investment, which means they can deliver this no problem. But I think that's going to be quite a challenge for that particular firm to deliver that job. And it's probably, you know, I don't think that's a unique case either. On payment, obviously there's been a lot of public, or at least very publicised, improvement in payment performance among the largest contractors, especially those involved in public sector works. Will that hold up now as we enter a downturn and jobs slow down and the cash slows down? So far, we're not hearing too much about payments slowing down, but it's more a case of just more pay less notices and more disputes around the amount of work being done. So this is going to be the real test of whether things like the prompt payment code, how much of an effect that's had, because it's quite easy to pay on time or to speed up your payment when the market's doing okay. It's a very different matter when times are tough. So finally, on the client side and the risk dumping, we were already here in 2019 that we were seeing more moves towards single stage procurement, more lump sum pricing. And these aren't inherently bad things, but when you see a growing trend across the industry of clients moving towards that, it signals that they're looking for not a bargain, but, you know, obviously they want to cut their costs as well. I found it quite concerning speaking to some, you know, very large blue chip infrastructure focused contractors saying that they are already seeing consultants advising clients to go further down that route and try and push more risk onto contractors. And I think, unfortunately, that seems like it's going to be that feature is probably going to return. So just to wrap it up then, I think looking at 2020, I think everyone, including contractors themselves, was surprised by how quickly they adapted to the pandemic and the challenges around social distancing, and also how lightly they were hit in the short term at least, especially when you consider some of the apocalyptic outlook that we had in March and April of sites being closed for 6 months and cash just drying up completely. And as Mark said in his presentation, construction has been one of the fastest industries to bounce back output-wise, certainly. But I think the real challenge now is navigating the slowdown and the risk that companies are going to face. They're going to be familiar to anyone who's been through a downturn before. And as I said, I think the three things to watch, which will determine sort of the winners and losers and the overall health of contractors in the industry in general, are the lowball bidding, which will store up problems for the future, especially if the downturn goes on longer than people expect. Payment problems, with slow payment, which will weaken the supply chain, which, you know, again has generates problems around quality and around investment for the future. And then finally, risk dumping by clients, which again stores up problems for contractors. Now, post-Carillion, we had a lot of positive talk that the industry was turning away from some of these persistent problems. But I think now is a real test of whether firms can actually maintain that track. And that's me done.
Thank you, David. That's very informative. Let's open up to the panel more generally now. So if I can perhaps think about some questions arising out of that. The survey that we did was earlier in the summer, and your survey was based on the results of the 100 companies earlier in the year. So do you think the results of the survey, if we did them now, would be very different?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the difficult things with the CM100. Speaking to people about results from 2019, it almost feels like you're talking about a different era. You know, 2019 was a year of improvement, and obviously 2020 has just been an absolute hammer blow. Yeah. People dipping into their cash reserves. We're already seeing sort of profit warnings, or, you know, Kia, which obviously have their full year results included this first 6 months of 2020 up to 30th of June. Saw a large loss from them due to short declines in revenue caused by the pandemic. So yeah, it's one of the tricky things with these sort of surveys is that they look backwards, and in the current environment, it feels like you're looking at a different era. But some of the trends, especially around cash, that does give us some information going forward.
Sure. What are you hearing from your clients, Brendan?
Yeah, David and I have spoken. We're very much on the same theme. I think David has really summarised it very well. I think big or small, the same considerations are into play. The stronger ones should be okay, and thank God for, you know, the government support. It's just how long it goes on for, I think, is the problem. And as David said, you know, can companies keep the discipline that they've tried to put in place, which is risk manage their businesses and look at everything in a long-term basis, not short-term. So I think that we're under threat here of a difficult situation, and it's going to be very difficult. We do need a bit of government support in terms of getting some of this activity together that would actually give some encouragement to people. When people win orders and get work and they get a spark, the good thing about, not good thing, COVID, everybody had work to go back to. Might have not been profitable, had work to go back to. Now, what's the work going to be for the pipeline? What is going to happen? What's going to come through? And that's what's going to sustain businesses. They do not have substantial working capital to have downturns for a long period of time. That's the issue.
That activity is quite interesting. Obviously, we good opportunity to do a little straw poll of the people watching on the webinar. I think we've got a little poll for you just to see where you think you are at the moment, which hopefully will appear on the screen. So give everybody a few minutes to vote. That would be really helpful. Okay. Well, hopefully that's given everybody enough time to push a button. Can we see the results, please? Wow, that is showing a slightly different situation to what we got in our survey earlier in the summer. So, 33% or 35%, sorry, saying that they don't anticipate turnover levels to get back to normal until at least 2021, and about roughly a third saying that they're nearly back to normal levels, pre-COVID levels, but not quite as confident as we were early in the year.
Robert, I think what's happened is the COVID second storm, if you like, has thrown a lot of people out. I think people were feeling a little bit more comfortable. They cope with it. They got all their businesses aligned. They got all the social distancing out. They got sorted out a lot of whatever they had to sort out. And I think they thought we're coming through it. I think the recent events have just knocked everybody back a little bit and thinking this isn't going away. We've got a longer haul here.
And that's what Mark Berrisford-Smith was saying in his presentation, wasn't he? That where are the next lot of projects going to come from? And that's maybe not quite such a strong. So in terms of the funding landscape, where do we think we are now? Have you any thoughts on that, David? The current moment.
You talk about funding for
funding
the client side. Sorry.
Funding for the construction companies generally. We when we looked at our survey previously, there was a remarkably low number of companies had taken advantage of the government schemes. I was just wondering if the sort of current thoughts are that might be changing.
Yeah, I think in terms of the government support, I think most firms, I think virtually all firms, availed themselves of the furlough scheme and the VAT and the PAYE deferrals. Fewer firms using the loan scheme, but still a considerable amount. A lot of companies saying, we've accessed, the CL bills, or in some cases the Bank of England scheme, but this is just contingency. We have no plans to use it, etc. So yeah, it's firms are definitely making sure they've got that buffer. How many of them actually have to use that will be interesting to see, especially as we get towards the end of the year, perhaps as more jobs finish, and you tend to get a bit of a cash squeeze at the end of the year. So yeah, I think that'll be definitely one to watch. Yeah,
and there was some quite good news in the Chancellor's recent statement on the winter economy plan. For people taking out those loans. I mean, Steve's one of our corporate finance partners, so he's a funding expert. So, what are your thoughts on this, Steve, at the moment?
I think we're seeing the opportunity for funders coming through, but because it's not the traditional bank funders, then we're looking at private equity as funding some construction subcontractors, which is quite surprising. Private equity has normally steered away from construction companies because of the project-driven nature of the work. So there must be people who are adapting to the circumstances and coming up with a different business plan that will attract private equity, which is good news.
Just on that, Steve, why do you think private equity is getting into construction now? Because as you said, it's not been a source of major source of funding in the past, except for a few cases like I think ISG and a couple of others. What is it about now? Are they seeing a bargain? Are they getting ready for a pickup in a couple of years or something?
I think that they're probably seeing that there's new technology that's coming into the market, which is allowing businesses to pivot on their business proposals and to have a slightly different business plan. And I think with any such industry where new technology is coming in, then private equity does get interested. And they do start thinking that there's opportunities that can be made, particularly with those people who are moving early to adapt their business plans.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I mean, again, we have another little poll to do in terms of the people watching as to whether they think they might be looking for additional funding. So if I can give you a couple of seconds to click a button, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, if we can just put up the results of that, hopefully that's long enough for everybody. So still showing that the majority of businesses are not looking to seek additional funding from government sources. So that's fairly consistent with what we've seen previously. So,
I think it's actually a slight mistake actually now, given the prognosis for winter and whatever. I can't actually see any reason for asking for some money and putting it in the back pocket and holding on to it just to give you that protection. But bearing in mind it's interest free at the moment and you can pay it back and whatever. So I think I'd be encouraging people to consider that a little bit more.
Because the deadline for the C-bills loans has been extended out to the end of November in terms of applications. So and then you've got an extended period to repay them first year. Yeah, arrangement fee and interest free.
Why not? Why not put it in your back pocket?
Yeah.
Several of my clients have done that. Several clients have just said, I'm just don't know what's around the corner. It's there for me. I'll have it.
You pay it back after a year. It's no harm done. Okay. Good. David mentioned technology, and and Steve did as well, in terms of the PE houses coming into the sector. What part do we think technology is going to play in the construction industry going forward? Any thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, I mean, the technology-wise, I mean, the big one which people have been looking at is off-site construction. Obviously, you've got some of the players like Lang & Rourke have invested hundreds of millions of pounds. Whether it's a major part of their business. Not sure if it's actually being profitable for them yet, but they're very confident that now is the time for that. Anyone who gets the Sunday Times might have noticed they've actually been putting ads in the paper, so they're clearly trying to get in people's minds. Off-site construction is the future. We are doing it. It's interesting, actually. There was a prior information notice went out the other day for £500 million teaching hospital in Leeds, and one of the requirements in that was for any prospective bidders to come with an off-site solution for delivering much of the hospital. So I think clearly government and public sector is definitely looking to that. So they seem to be quite sold on it. But again, it's not something you get into cheaply. As I said, Lang & Rourke have spent hundreds of millions of pounds on that. No one sets up an off-site operation on the cheap. Some of the off-site house builders that we're seeing in LNG, billions and billions of pounds of capital they can back that with. There's another one, Top Hat Technologies. They've got Goldman Sachs investing in them. So there's clearly a lot of money is going into off-site. And people are looking for faster, cheaper ways to build, obviously. And there's also now the added argument that with off-site construction, it's a bit easier to do social distancing as well, because you're working in a factory where you can control the environment a bit more. So it could be that, off-site, its day has finally come, but, its day has been coming for about 50, 60 years. So, maybe won't start, waving the checker flag just yet. But, I think that's definitely an interesting one to watch.
Brendan was saying to me the other day that it's used far more in other parts of Europe as well.
Yeah, in Scandinavia, a huge amount, because, Skanska have now brought over their, I think it's pronounced Buklu, or maybe Boklok, modular houses, which they've been doing with IKEA in Sweden for about 25, 30 years. And I think they're doing their first 3 projects of that in Bristol. And also there's a Japanese company, whose name escapes me right now, and they've partnered up with a company that was owned by Urban Splash, I think, to do modular housing. So there's a huge amount of modular housing in Japan, and they've been doing it there for decades as well. So there's this. It's interesting to see that from multiple angles, we're seeing more people get into the off-site way of building. I think that's definitely an interesting area to watch. And again, some of these private equity backers, that could be where they get their big fat margins from if that really takes off and proves a success.
And what about the construction industry with actually the implementation of green technology? We saw some announcements from the government, I can't remember, it was over last night or this morning, around the wind farms. We're going to have 100% of the wind farm energy produced by wind farms by 2030, I think it was. Obviously that's clearly quite a lot of money ploughed into the infrastructure projects on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's avoiding the question of how green contractors are themselves. And there's a lot of companies making a lot of effort for that. I think there's still a bit too much offsetting, where they are producing high levels of emissions and then just planting some trees somewhere, which kind of shifts the problem, doesn't really solve it. But in terms of the how they could benefit from the economy getting greener, I think absolutely. I think if the government is going to start pump priming and trying to get the economy going, moving towards a greener society in terms of energy generation, things like electric car charging, refurbing buildings, making buildings more energy efficient, not particularly sexy, but there's a lot of money to be done in improving the old building stock. That could be an area where contractors could benefit hugely.
Okay.
If I could just comment on that, I think one of the drivers will be construction. When people build properties, commercial, residential, whatever, and particularly commercial, investors want to know that the property is going to hold its value for years to come. And actually, if you're building stuff that isn't going to have that length of time, they won't invest. So I think from the top down, the investment will come, that they will drive for better materials, better quality, such that the contractors will have to deliver. I think that's where it will come from. And I think that is what is the change that's coming into the market.
Yeah. In terms of the labour market for the sector, where are thoughts on that? I mean, confidence levels, obviously, the people have mentioned second wave of COVID. We've got Brexit coming up, and goodness knows what that's going to do to the sector. We've got the shenanigans with the US election coming up, which I think is going to have a knock-on impact across the world, depending on what the outcome of there is. What are your thoughts on the labour market? We actually have a question from one of the viewers. Is talking about Eastern European skilled labour. I work with a company that engages mostly Eastern European skilled labour with EU transitional arrangements ending on 31st December 20. I'm interested in the panel's views on the availability of skilled labour post that date. Any thoughts on that? Any of you?
I think the skilled labour, especially sort of Eastern European skilled workers, it's more of an issue for London and the South East. Typically, the labour force in say the North East, North West, South West tends to be more indigenous British. How much of a risk it poses in terms of Brexit and tougher immigration, it's hard to say, because it is going to be coming in at a time where demand is slowing. So you would expect to see a fall in the need for site labour. But how many really skilled workers stay in the UK? How many choose to return to Europe? How many come to the UK after Brexit? I mean, this is still huge unknowns. Maybe things will shake out and it'll achieve some kind of equilibrium. It's still a huge unknown. I know there's certain sectors where it threatens to be a more pronounced issue. I think cladding is the main one, where there's a lot of concern there around skill shortages post Brexit. But you just hope that the government, that they will listen to the industry, which they've not been the best at doing throughout the Brexit travail so far. And if there are issues with labour supply, that they will amend the immigration rules so that the industry can get the workers they need. Because you can invest in more training in the UK, but it takes years for someone to go from a green apprentice to a skilled worker. And the only way to fill that gap, if we get an increase in demand, is going to be workers from abroad.
I know, Brendan, you've done some work around the employment market or the labour market. What are your thoughts on that in London?
London has a problem, and what you also find is you get various companies that have been very dependent on that. And that's, I think, where the concern is. I think some of the broader based companies will not suffer so badly, and maybe even attract, which we've done in the past, labour from up north or whatever. I'm not sure, and I should follow this a little bit more closely. I thought there were going to be some exemptions where people already in the UK actually can carry on, so that there may be some sort of weaning that may take place, which may flatten the problem for the first year or two. But it is a concern, and the construction industry is going to have to get back to its recruiting, training, and really actually invest in the future, and use technology to cover for some of the skill gaps.
I suppose the company's intentions regarding their workforce is probably a good indicator of where they feel their confidence lies with the sector. And I know we have a little poll there for people's views on their workforce going forward over the next year or so, which we can give people an opportunity to just have a quick look at and answer a question, hopefully. There we go.
Yeah, but just add one thing on the issue of foreign-born workers. One of my colleagues, Zach Garner-Perkins, he's done a lot of work in that area, and speaking to workers who've come from the EU and especially Eastern Europe. And for them, they were not too concerned about Brexit and immigration rules. The main deciding factor for them, whether they stay in the UK or go return to their home country or go to a different country to work was the value of the pound compared to the euro. If we see that fall more after Brexit because of disorderly Brexit or whatever, then staying in the UK to work becomes a less attractive proposition. So I think that's something definitely to keep an eye on.
I suppose the other thing that could get an impact of a no transition Brexit is the impact on the supply chain generally.
In terms of materials.
Yeah.
I think a lot of firms seem to be quite calm about that. I think a lot of firms have been, really digging into their supply chains, finding out where products come from, what their alternatives are if there are problems because of a no deal. Again, I think cladding. That's the main issue. There's an awful lot of cladding which is produced in Eastern Europe. I think there's some concern about timber as well. But again, companies have had sort of 2-3 years to prepare for this. Obviously, there's only so much preparation you can do because we are entering the unknown again. But it doesn't seem to be something that they are panicking about, should we say?
Okay. Well, but thanks very much, David. We've got the result of the poll, which was overwhelmingly, I think, that businesses are looking to either stay the same or even increase labour. So that's good news for the sector. I think we've got 74% that are looking to stay the same or increase. So that sounds like good news. We've got one good question for the from one of the viewers, which is: are there any positives to COVID?
I think there are. I know it's hard to get your head around it, but I'm encouraged by the technology that's being thought about and how people are adjusting to the changes. I think it's waking up the construction industry, and I think they will think about better methods of production and delivery. The worry is there won't be the work there to do it, but I do think I'm very impressed with some of the thoughts that are going into the technology, and it's not just the timesheets and stuff, but when we're talking about robotics, when we're talking about communications, where actually teams on sites are actually making instant decisions to actually get things sorted, get things approved, get things signed off, which again improves efficiency. I think people are trying to recognise that they have to improve now, and I think technology will drive that business. So I do think we're making some progress, and I do think there will be some long-term benefits, and technology probably will be the main one.
Yeah, and there's been obviously, there's been talk about infrastructure projects. There's the impact of off-site working for companies. Health and welfare seems to be obviously is more of a priority for companies, for their staff. I suppose the green revolution that people have spoken about is also something that's likely to get embedded over time. So, I suppose there has been some positives. Anything else you could think of, David? Controversial question.
Well, I think it just kind of it just reminds you of the saying, don't waste a good crisis. This is a chance for people to really rethink not just how they operate as contractors, but how the public sector procures work. What kind of where they want to put their money. I think as Brendan said, contractors have adapted. I've had some companies say, we've done 5 years progress in less than 6 months because we've been forced to. And I think it's perhaps realigned people's expectations about how quickly they can adapt and how quickly they can do new things. So, I think that will definitely be a positive to come out of it.
David, can I ask you a question? It's off the top of my head, but it came up the other day, and it was a client phoned me up and said, the issue we've got here is on bidding. Every time they take the lowest bid, and apparently in America they actually take the medium bid. The guy at the top doesn't want it, so he's overbid. The guy at the bottom probably can't deliver, but he's cut. And should we bring some sort? And government could lead on this. We're talking about government leading on, off-site, but they could also do it on the bidding process. They could actually say, we want more than whatever number of bids, and we won't take the lowest. I just wonder whether there should be a change at the top here, which would help a lot of businesses.
I think that's really interesting. I've not heard that before about the American contractor market, but I think that's a really interesting way to go about it. I think you're absolutely right as well. The government, they are the biggest clients in the UK. They kind of set the standard in a lot of ways. I think, yeah, there's a very strong argument for them to go down that route. I mean, we have seen changes in procurement where quality is definitely receiving a higher weighting in bids now. But I think, you know, when push comes down to shove, if you've got a government department, you know, we're talking about central government here. I think when you get to local government, it's a different story. They've got some really tight budgets, but central government, you know, when you've got a bunch of bids coming in for something which is perhaps not a flagship, you know, piece of investment, and you've got, you know, someone who's coming in and they're maybe 5% lower than the rest, you know, some civil servant, he's got a budget to try and meet. I think sometimes the money angle just takes over, but, you know, again, you know, don't waste a good crisis. You know, I think this is a time where, you know, could be bold and say, you know, we're gonna procure the best, not the cheapest.
Well, that would be a good one. Hopefully that's what we've done today with our panelists, and thank you very much, David, for your time and insightful thoughts. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Steve, and thank you everybody for watching.